All right, I have something pretty exciting for you today, or at least I'm excited about it. It kind of combines a number of things that I'm just passionate about, I suppose. So one is Bethlehem Records. I'm sure I've said this in a video before. I just have a soft spot for Bethlehem. I just completed the entire discography of the label. Not all the 7 inches, but I actually have a lot of the 7 inches, but all the 10 inches, and then all of the 12-inch releases with the exception of like there's a couple of compilations that I don't have, and I'm like, why would I listen to that when I have the original source material, right? Because they put out some like 12 inches that were compilations of 10 inches. Anyway, I made it a point early on in my collecting to try to get a bunch from the Bethlehem label because I think at the time it was easier to get. I love the cover art and also most importantly the music. Not only does it capture a lot of really interesting, cool jazz, but it also captures a lot of East Coast musicians early on in their career. They put out work for Bethlehem maybe before they went on to do bigger and better things. So that's one thing, Bethlehem. The next is Charles Mingus. Charles Mingus is one of my favorite musicians. He just is. I don't know what it is. He's a brilliant composer, obviously. His music is chaotic and hectic, and it's complicated. I remember in college we attempted to play the track Monin, not Monin like the Art Blakey Blue Note record, but Mingus's composition Monin. And I just found it a fascinating challenge to play that tune because Mingus would compose these very sort of robust orchestrated pieces, but then intersperse it with sections where it would be like spontaneous improvisation by a group. So like everybody would be improvising simultaneously, and it made for a lot of I think really exciting moments. So you've got Bethlehem, you have Mingus, and then the other thing is with this reissue that's out, it's by Newland. Newland Records recently put out this title by Blue Mitchell, and they recently put out Howard McGee's Bethlehem, one of his two Bethlehem albums, which were just phenomenally done. And these aren't the only two, and they have more in the pipeline, from what I understand. So, really excited for this new label. And part of that fascination, obviously, is because they seem to have an affinity for Bethlehem, just like I do, right? So I'm excited about that. I'm excited what's to come. But today, we are going to talk about this album right here, which is a modern jazz symposium of music and poetry with Charlie Mingus. And I put emphasis on Charlie because he really didn't like to be called Charlie, supposedly. I've only read this. It's not like I've talked to the guy. But apparently he hated it. So it's always interesting to me because I think they were I don't know if they're trying to portray him as like a friendly musician, which he certainly wasn't, or if they just got it wrong. But anyway, in any event, they would often on album covers and in liner notes refer to him as Charlie, and he didn't enjoy it. So this album was just came out, I want to say last Friday. And I was excited to hear it. I was excited to compare it to my original because my original is really hurting, right? You can probably see it from here, but if not, this is what it looks like. There's not a whole lot of gloss left on this thing. You have tape on the top and the bottom, obviously. There's a ton of ring wear. This album, though, I swear, this album came out of the factory like this. Like every single copy I've ever seen just looks atrocious. I don't know. Bethlehem Records, I mean, they weren't, I suppose, known for the quality of either the covers nor the vinyl. Especially later on, they started pressing on styrene, which didn't always sound good. They also had issues pressing in stereo. There's a lot of weird abnormalities with, I want to say, the Zeus Sims record. What else did they put out? The Charles Persip record. There's a few of those like later ones that were put in stereo that just sound odd, like it wasn't supposed to be done in stereo, and I have no idea what they did to the albums. So again, pressing quality, cover quality, so therefore, was excited to get a new version of this thing. Is that going to stay? We'll see. And so here we are. So a little bit about this album. I want to set some context. It was released in 1959. However, it was recorded in 1957. 1957 was a very prolific year for Charles Mingus. He was done with his own debut records label, so he had left that. But let's see, leading up to the recording of this album in 1957, he had done East Coasting, which is another fantastic Charles Mingus record for Bethlehem. Before that, he recorded Tijuana Moods. It's kind of an interesting album. That was for RCA Victor, I think. I think that was RCA Victor that he put that out on. It wasn't Columbia. And that one wasn't released until 1962. So it was shelved and released later. He also recorded The Clown in 1957, which in many ways I think is sort of thematically similar to this record. Maybe I'm only saying that because there is a narrator, sort of spoken word, almost poetry, but really more of a spoken word type of thing on this record, especially in the first track, which is like 11 minutes. So it's a long one of a lot of spoken word. But then Mingus also was it was his band that backed a Langston Hughes album the same year, I want to say. Maybe it was a year later, and that's called The Weary Blues. So Mingus was experimenting, incorporating jazz with spoken word and poetry quite a bit. You also on this album have sort of like shouts and conversation kind of happening, and it's chaotic in a number of ways, right? Both in terms of the music as well as in terms of the spoken word. So anyway, all of this content seemed to be recorded right before a little bit of a hiatus, because Mingus had this incredibly prolific 1957. Not all of that music was actually released. Much of it was shelved, including, like I said, including this in Tijuana Moods. But then there's this like period of time where in 1958 he was on one session, and then he started becoming more active again in 1959 and 1960. So I don't know. It's a weird period of time. He was experimenting in a lot of different ways, and then he kind of like left the scene for a little bit, and then he came back. What I would say in terms of a recommendation, if you're going to listen to this album, whether you're going to preview it or whether you're going to blind buy it, which you can pretty much blind buy it because you're going to enjoy it, I would say that it requires focused listening. This isn't a term that I've come up with. I think a lot of, I don't know if it's audiophiles or just, people who listen to music. It's like, do you want to have something in the background? Do you want to sort of be casually engaged by it? Or do you really want to shut out everything else and just listen to the album? I think this is one of those where you just want to listen to the album. Sort of free from distractions. So the music is frenetic, it's chaotic, and you just kind of need to pay attention to get some of the nuances of the music. In addition to that, anybody who's not as much of a jazz fan as you are, who's in your household, they hear this music in the next room, they're going to be like, turn it down or something, because the dynamics on this album are so extreme. You have very, very quiet, and then you have very, very loud, and so you kind of have to be conscious of that, so you're not getting up and down to turn the volume up or down, probably mostly down. So all of that being said, I don't want to scare people off. It really is the opening track, I would say, is the most chaotic, but there are so many brilliant moments, as there always are on Mingus's albums, and sort of nods to history and nods to the time period that it was recorded in. He has a lot of thematic music, right? So there's this element of living in the city and being in the Black community that is so present here on this album, and I just think you have to listen to it, like I said, free from distractions in order to sort of fully process some of what's going on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the original pressing, but I think more of this video I'm going to focus on this new release, and that's just going to be how it's going to be. So you have some context. Let's talk about this original pressing. So my copy is a mono copy, and it has plenty of scratches on it. Guess what? But surprisingly enough, they're actually not as disruptive as I would have thought. I actually would have thought that this would have a bigger noise floor than it does. I would have expected that some of those scratches would have been deeper, or sorry, more apparent just by looking at them, because they looked like they were deep. But in any event, it actually does sound pretty good for what it is. You always have to say for what it is when you're talking about Bethlehem and when you're talking about 1957. I mean, what labels were actually putting out really great sounding records in 1957, with the exception of Blue Note and like what Atlantic, Contemporary, right? Those are probably the hallmarks of quality, because at the same time I can say that those are the good ones. There's like 10 times as many, not 10 times, but you know what I mean, a ton of other labels that were not putting out great quality stuff in 1957. So it sounds good. In terms of the music, I said this before. I think I said this before. Maybe I just thought it. But the opening track is called "Scenes in the City," and it is an 11-minute track. With, I would say, mostly spoken word, and it's set to music though, right? So it isn't just poetry, or it isn't just spoken word, but it's a lot of that, and it's set to music, and it's 11 minutes long. And the point of that, it really, I think, sets the tone for the album. And it kind of portrays a scene of a man who's living in New York City, who has a connection to jazz. But it also tells a little bit of the story of jazz, I want to say, in terms of they actually have, it's really interesting. There's a moment where they talk about like Miles and Monk and Dizzy and like Bird, JJ, and they reference each of these musicians, and then one of the musicians in the band actually plays like a little like line as if it was them. It's a little. It's almost a little silly, almost like you're like demoing for kids or something, like what different sounds sound like. But in a way, it just kind of works. You know, I mean, Mingus was certainly I'm sure a student of bebop, even though he was never. I personally don't think he was ever trying to mimic anybody. I don't think he was trying to play like Bird. And I know that sounds weird because he's a bassist. How would he do that? But you'd be surprised at how many of these musicians would be taking so much, right, out of another musician on another instrument. Mingus really seemed to walk his own path. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I like him. And I just don't think that you'd hear an 11-minute opener in 1957 on any album that sounds quite like this. So anyway, it's a long format thing. It's very chaotic. A couple of notes about the audio quality. The narrator, it sounds fine, but you can tell he's in a studio, and maybe even a studio that has a little bit of echo. Well, because there's an echo. And so when he's speaking, you can kind of hear this echo. It almost sounds a little eerie in a way. And I don't think that necessarily that was the intent, but it definitely has a stage kind of feel. It doesn't feel like it's a natural kind of out in the world conversation that he's having with other people. It feels like a theatrical production, partially because of that echo. So what I would say about this is generally speaking, the chaoticness of Charles Mingus's compositions, really difficult to capture on vinyl. At least, I mean, unless you're just expecting them to sound chaotic, because it does. But if what you're expecting is to be able to hear each of the musicians and capture some of the nuances, it's just difficult on vinyl, and especially in mono. I think if they were able to separate the musicians into two channels, like they did on the stereo reissue, then there'd be the opportunity to have a little bit more sort of separation. You'd be able to hear a little bit, because your ear would kind of be like shifting back and forth, and you'd be able to kind of like capture, right, the separation between some of the instruments. But you can't really get that on the mono, and so, you know, again, it's chaotic, meant to sound chaotic, and it does. It does sound that way. In the opener, I would say, because there isn't as much sort of detail in some of the sound, there's this like frenetic trombone lines that are like blah, 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 blah. Like it's just kind of this like blur of like stuff that's supposed to be individual notes, I think, with individual attacks. It's not like the slide is like what's causing it to the note to change. But it just sounds blurred, and I think it's because, again, the lack of detail with this original pressing. And it becomes even more complicated, I think, when the trombone is layered with the tenor, which is layered with the trumpet. And all of these musicians kind of playing over each other and around each other, right? And somebody will start and then somebody will pick it up, or they'll be playing simultaneously but completely different lines. And all of that can get a little distracting, because there's just so much. The cymbal work here is, I'd say hot, right? The cymbals are quite prominent, and it's at the expense of a number of the other instruments, which is a little unfortunate. But again, I think on something like this, it's just difficult to have it be balanced. Using the techniques that they had back then, as well as the fact that this is a mono presentation. So, am I unhappy with the original pressing? I mean, listen, it's the only version I've had to listen to for so long, and this album does stand out, I would suppose, a little bit in Mingus's discography because of how different it is, even though it sounds in some ways like The Clown, but it's nothing like. I don't want to say it's nothing like, but it's clear that Mingus's style was much more polished once you got to like Blues and Roots, or once you got to Black Sinner Lady. But you still have those kind of like dense composed sections with the spontaneous improvisation, and so there's plenty of elements that kind of move through. But in some ways this just feels a little raw. So sounds good, but all of that being said, I was certainly happy or excited to be able to hear what this latest reissue would sound like. All right, so that reissue. First of all, though, I know I just messed up the name of the song. It's not Black Sinner Lady. It's Black Saint and the Sinner Lady. So I apologize for that. It's just one of those things, and I don't like to do second takes. So how about that? This is all off the cuff. So this is the reissue. This is a double LP. Okay, this one is not a double LP, and this is not in 45 RPM. So this is a double LP, meaning there is additional content, which is great. So this has been remastered by Kevin Gray. So that there's going to be some quality there. The jacket looks great. I'm not generally big on jackets, but everybody shows jackets and they do close-ups and stuff in these videos. And so I apologize if that's what you're interested in. I usually like to talk more about the music than I do about the sort of the package, but they do a great job. This is not laminated, and I don't know why that's a problem. Some people are like, is it tip-on, Stoughton jacket, whatever? But this is high quality, right? There's a nice texture to it, and it's nice. So and more than that, inside the gatefold, you have this lovely image taken by Bert Goldblatt, who I'm a big fan of. Have a separate Instagram account just focused on his artwork, and I have a number of his pieces hanging in my listening room here. Topic for a later video. So there is double LP here. What you get is the original album in stereo, and then you get an alternative version of the track Slippers, which is a little bit longer than the one that made the album. You get a single edit. So I mentioned Scenes in the City is an 11+ minute track. Well, they decided to make a single because, for all that radio play that a spoken word mixed with jazz Charles Mingus track would get. More importantly, and I'll get into this, you get 2 tracks that weren't included on the original album. They're really exciting, but we'll get into that in just a second. So, a couple of differences here, I suppose. Firstly, I mentioned in the original that the narrator has a little bit of an echo, kind of gave it a theatrical kind of element to it, which I don't think necessarily supports the album. On this reissue, the narrator doesn't have an echo. It does feel more natural. It feels more like a polished album. Than I think the original does. I actually think that the stereo format adds quite a bit here, and I'm not sure if this album was ever put out originally on Bethlehem in stereo. It could have been, and obviously there's the stereo version that exists somewhere. At least, I mean, the original tapes. They must have recorded it in stereo, so maybe there is. But the stereo works really, really well for all the reasons that I mentioned as I was speculating when I was talking about the original, about how if you could separate these musicians, then you'd be able to get more of the sort of separation between the instruments, more sort of distinction and all of that, and it would just sound better and be easier to hear and process exactly what's happening, considering how chaotic it is. So it is in stereo. Generally speaking, the music and sort of accents, especially on that opening track, or I guess not especially, but in this example, on the opening track, they're much brighter and much more present. So it isn't like sort of lost. There was elements on the original where like a musician would start to play and you'd miss the first few notes. They'd be like really soft, and then they would almost like be mic'd, and then they would go away and not be mic'd anymore. I don't know what the process was like. Maybe they were literally walking up to one of the two microphones in the room and doing their little bit and then walking away. I have no idea. But whatever the situation, it's just it just sounds better here. The bass is very present in the mix, but it doesn't come across as boomy, which I think is nice. I think it seems easy on some of these just to up the bass. And in this case, I'm talking about like sort of the sonic element rather than the instrument. But here, both the sonic element as well as the instrument just sound better, and it's not boomy. So yeah, it sounds really good. So let's see. What else? I think one of the biggest indicators that this album was simply made better is actually towards the tail end of that first Scenes in the City 11-minute track. Simply because some of these nuances are a little bit harder to pick up when you're paying attention to the spoken word. But there is a little bit of an instrumental break that sounds really good, and they kind of cue it because the bass just like starts like walking really quick or like running or whatever, right? It's like going really, really quick. And then it sets up this kind of instrumental thing before it then goes back to spoken word. But that little bit, like my ears perked up and I was like, oh my God, that sounds really, really good. So I think that sort of forecasts some of the other highlights throughout the rest of the album. So speaking of some of those highlights, I want to just say one thing really quick first up front. So in many ways, Mingus's compositions were experiments, right? That he would continue to noodle on over the years. And so if you listen to something that he put out in the 70s, you might actually get, in fact, it's pretty likely, you're going to get elements of his compositions from the 50s. And it could be under a completely different name, completely different like sort of format in terms of the musicians and the instruments. And so it's kind of interesting, I think, to track Mingus's work over a period of time because you get to see how his pieces evolve. And in many ways, like he would take a piece and it would evolve over time, but he would never play it the same way that he used to, right? Because in his head, the composition just kind of took a life on its own, and it was something else. It became something else. And so there's actually 3 pieces on this album that later come together and were included on Mingus's album called for Columbia. And the piece is called Open Letter to Duke on right? And actually, incidentally, Open Letter to Duke, I want to say is the name of it's the name of an album by Masaru Imada on Three Blind Mice label, which is a great album. Anyway, quick tangent there. So anyway, the second track on this first side is one such track that later became Open Letter to Duke, along with 2 others that are on this album. And this track on this album is called New Rug, something like that. And it's just a really dynamic track. It's really exciting. And I think even if that first track, that 11-minute one, is difficult for you to get through, you're going to really get into track 2 onward. The tenor part is performed by, I may butcher his name, Shafi Hadi. It's really beautiful, really dynamic. Incidentally, Shafi, I believe he was born Curtis Porter, kind of a mysterious musician because he played a lot with Mingus. He played a little bit with Hank Mobley. And then he was doing, I want to say, he was doing composing or orchestration into the late 60s, and then he disappeared, and no one really seems to know what happened to him. There apparently is a date of death sort of recorded by the Social Security Administration, but I think the details are very limited on exactly what became of him. So anyway, kind of a mysterious guy, but man, does he sound good. His tenor part on New Rug is really a highlight of this album, and it's featured on that particular track. So definitely check that one out. All right, a couple of more quick notes before I let you go. So, side B of the album, and again on this reissue that I have over there now, is called New York Sketchbook. That's the opener. Really beautiful. There's sort of a loud ringing piano that I think sounds particularly good. The pianist's name is Bob Hammer. He actually only just passed away late last year. And I believe that there's like a snippet of an interview with him in the Inside the Gatefold, and there's sort of a dedication to him as well. But he sounds really good. There's sort of a improvisation by the horns as well while he's playing his piano lines that create a really nice texture. And it's one of those like subtle things, right? Because he could just play a improvisational piano and leave it at that with rhythm section. But instead he's backed by these accents by the horns, and those accents are they seem to be improvisation as well. So I always find it really interesting when you have these kind of like extended, sometimes complicated improvisation by the backing musicians while you have the primary improvisation or soloist who's playing up front. So that's really interesting. Overall, I think that the presentation of this double LP is a success in and of itself, even if we were just talking about that reproduction of the original album. So stereo format allows for better separation. It's more dynamic of a recording. It's more engaging. You can actually hear the musicians better, and there's better balance in it. It just simply sounds nice. Now, fortunately for us, there is more, right? There's these extra tracks, and I would say that it's all worthwhile. But I'm going to single out the 2 tracks that were not included on the original album, and they are called "Woody and You," and that's on side C, and then "Billy's Bounce" on side D. I personally think, listening to Billy's Bounce, this is the best version of that track, and it is such a standard, right? Everybody's played it. I think it's the best version I've ever heard. It sounds really, really good. All the musicians seem to be having a great time. The solos are fantastic. It's really dynamic. Similar comments, I think, for Woody and You. Both of these 2 tracks that apparently were just part of the recording session just sound great. And I don't know why they weren't included, except that this album is a little bit, kind of has this like running theme, I think, with this, again, with some of the nods to New York and kind of the spoken word, almost story right up front. And maybe those 2 tracks were meant to sort of warm up the band and get them get their chops up and get them used to playing with each other. Although these musicians were had all been playing with Mingus for quite some time. But in any event, it's really interesting that these two amazing tracks were not included, but they are such fantastic additions to this release and are very, very worthwhile. So in summation, I think that this is a great release. Similar to some of these others, right, that I showed you up front. They just did a great job. It's definitely worth picking up. I know that you can order it directly from Newland, but for those who like to, not pay for international shipping, I know that oftentimes Acoustic Sounds gets Newland's releases, and there could be other channels as well. I'm just not familiar enough. I happen to get this one directly from Europe. From the UK, I believe, is where Newland is based, but really no complaints. I mean, this thing, worthwhile edition, and now, I mean, this is one of the situations where I probably will be getting rid of this other version, just because this is the one I'm going to want to hear all the time. I love the stereo presentation. So that's it. Thanks very much. Hit the notification bell, hit subscribe. See you next time.